Black waitress is fired for helping Steph Curry. Next day, she gets the shock of her life. Amara had no idea that standing up for a stranger, a man quietly enjoying pie in her small-town diner, would cost her the job she depended on to keep her family afloat. But when the whispers grew louder and the tension boiled over, she knew she couldn't stay silent, even if it meant facing consequences. Little did she know, the next day would bring a twist she never saw coming, one that would change her life forever. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of inspiration. Sonny's Diner had been Amara's sanctuary for the past 3 years. Nestled in a quiet corner of town, it was a place where time seemed to slow down, with its red vinyl booths, checkered floors, and the faint aroma of coffee that never seemed to leave. Amara, a 29-year-old waitress with a warm smile and quick wit, had become a fixture in the diner's daily rhythm. Her days were a medley of taking orders, filling coffee cups, and sharing laughs with the quirky regulars who treated Sonny's like their second home. Despite her cheerful demeanor, Amara carried a weight that no one in the diner truly saw. Between shifts, she juggled overdue bills, helped her younger sister with college applications, and managed her mother's mounting medical appointments. Life had thrown her challenges, but she met them with quiet resilience. She didn't complain. What good would it do? But some nights, as she closed up the diner, she felt the crushing weight of responsibility pressing against her chest. It was a Thursday morning when Amara's leadership quietly came into focus. The diner buzzed with its usual mix of clinking coffee mugs and friendly chatter. Regulars like Earl, the gruff retired mechanic, and sweet Mrs. Fletcher, who loved to knit at the corner booth, were in their usual spots. The morning rush was in full swing when the tension started to build. "Hey, that's my seat," an older man barked, his voice cutting through the cozy hum of conversation. Mara turned to see Mr. Henry, a regular who prided himself on always sitting by the window, standing with his arms crossed. A younger customer, who clearly wasn't familiar with the unspoken rules of Sonny's, had taken his usual booth. "I've been sitting there every day for years," Mr. Henry added, his tone sharp. The younger man looked up, startled. "I didn't know it was reserved. I just sat down." "Oh." The room fell silent as conversations halted and heads turned. Even Earl stopped mid-sip of his coffee to watch the unfolding drama. Amara stepped in before the situation could escalate. "Mr. Henry," she said, her voice light but firm, "how about this? Today, you'll make history by trying something new. The booth by the counter just opened up, and I'll throw in extra whipped cream on your pie. Deal?" Mr. Henry hesitated, his brows furrowing, but Amara's playful tone and warm smile disarmed him. With a grumble, he shuffled to the counter, where she handed him a fresh cup of coffee. "On the house," she added with a wink. The younger customer looked relieved, nodding a silent thanks as he stayed in the window seat. The diner buzzed back to life, the brief tension forgotten. But for Amara, the moment lingered. She had diffused the conflict with a touch of humor and understanding, traits that had become second nature to her. It wasn't the first time she'd stepped in to smooth over a disagreement, but she didn't think much of it. To her, it was just part of the job. As the morning wore on, Amara found herself reflecting on the incident. She knew how to handle people, how to navigate their quirks and frustrations. It was a skill she'd honed over years of working with the public. But she often wondered if it meant anything beyond these walls. Her world felt small sometimes, confined to the diner and the endless cycle of responsibilities that awaited her outside of it. That day, however, a flicker of something stirred within her, a question she couldn't quite shake. Was she capable of more? It was an unremarkable evening at Sonny's Diner. The dinner rush had thinned out, leaving only a handful of regulars scattered across the booths. Earl sat hunched at the counter, nursing his third coffee of the evening, while Mrs. Fletcher's knitting needles clicked softly in her usual corner. The hum of the jukebox filled the quiet gaps in conversation, its retro tunes a soothing backdrop to the diner's nightly rhythm. Amara had just set down a fresh pot of coffee when the door jingled, drawing her attention. Her first instinct was to glance up with her usual friendly smile, but she froze mid-step. A tall man in a gray hoodie and baseball cap entered, the casual outfit doing little to hide his unmistakable presence. The man moved with an easy confidence, but there was something about the way he kept his head low, his hands tucked in his pockets, that gave him away. Mara blinked, convinced she was seeing things. Is that... She didn't dare finish the thought, instead watching as he scanned the diner briefly before settling into a booth near the back. The fluorescent light caught the faint stubble on his jaw and the familiar contours of his face, confirming what she'd already suspected. Her mind raced. Steph Curry? Here? In Sonny's? Shh. At first, she thought she must be mistaken. A diner in a small, tucked-away town wasn't exactly the kind of place you'd expect a global superstar to show up. Maybe he got lost, she wondered, her hand gripping the coffee pot a little tighter. But as she walked toward his booth, the familiar features and the calm, understated confidence in his posture became undeniable. The room seemed to change the moment he walked in. Even those who didn't immediately recognize him could sense something different about the air. The usual clatter of dishes and muted conversations softened to a hush. And Amara could already hear the faint murmur starting among the regulars. Just coffee, black, Steph said when she reached his table, his voice low but steady. And whatever pie you recommend. Amara nodded, her professional demeanor kicking in despite the nerves prickling at the back of her neck. We've got apple, cherry, and lemon meringue tonight, she said, trying to keep her tone casual. Lemon's my favorite. But lemons aren't usualized, Diana said. Lemon it is, he replied with a small smile, though his eyes kept darting around the room as if scanning for something, or someone. She couldn't help but notice how out of place he looked. Not in a way that made him seem uncomfortable, he carried himself too calmly for that, but there was a subtle tension in the way he adjusted his hoodie and kept his back to the wall. It was as if he were trying to shrink into the booth, to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. Yet his very effort to blend in only seemed to magnify his presence. As she turned to fetch his coffee and pie, Amara heard the whispers begin to ripple across the diner. Mrs. Fletcher paused mid-kit to glance toward the booth, while Earl leaned toward the next stool over, muttering something that made the younger man sitting there nod in agreement. That's him, isn't it? One customer murmured under his breath. Steph Curry, someone else whispered, barely audible, but with enough excitement to send a ripple through the quiet. Amara moved quickly, setting down the coffee and pie with a practiced hand. Here you go, she said, her voice a little softer now. Let me know if you need anything else. Thanks, he said, his tone polite but distant. He kept his eyes down as he picked up the coffee cup, and for a moment, Amara wondered if he regretted coming in. The whispers hadn't stopped. In fact, they seemed to grow louder, the curiosity in the room bubbling into something just shy of commotion. Earl, of course, couldn't resist making a comment. What's he doing here? He said, loudly enough for the room to hear. Probably slumming it to show us regular folks he's just like us. Mara shot Earl a warning glance, but he only shrugged and went back to stirring his coffee, clearly unbothered by the tension he'd just stirred up. Across the room, Steph's expression remained calm, though his grip on the coffee cup tightened slightly. Just let me know if anyone bothers you, Amara said quietly, hoping her words might reassure him. He looked up then, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. There was a quiet gratitude there, layered with something else she couldn't quite place. Appreciate it, he said simply, his voice steady. As she turned back toward the counter, Amara could still feel the room buzzing behind her. Earl's comment had lit a fuse, and she had no doubt there was more to come. She just hoped, for everyone's sake, that it wouldn't escalate. The low hum of whispers in the diner grew louder, like static filling the air. Amara moved swiftly behind the counter, refilling coffee mugs and avoiding eye contact with the regulars, but she could feel their curiosity bubbling just below the surface. Earl, the self-appointed commentator of Sonny's, had been unusually quiet after his initial jab. She had hoped he'd leave it at that, but Earl wasn't the type to let an opportunity for drama pass him by. Sure enough, as Steph took another sip of his coffee, Earl leaned back in his stool and cleared his throat loudly, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. "So, what's he doing here?" he said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Let me guess, slumming it to prove he's one of the people." The room fell silent. Amara froze mid-step, the plate of cherry pie she was carrying teetering in her hand. Every eye in the diner darted toward the back booth where Steph sat. He didn't flinch, his calm demeanor unshaken as he placed his coffee cup back on its saucer. Amara shot Earl a sharp look, her tone quiet but firm. "Earl, don't start." But he was just getting warmed up. Earl had always taken pride in being the loudest voice in the room, especially when it came to calling out anyone he thought was full of it. And now, sitting a few feet away from him, was a man he considered the epitome of performative wealth and fame. "So, you're the great Steph Curry," Earl said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he turned in his stool to face the booth directly. "What's the plan here, huh? Grab a coffee, make yourself look good for the cameras, maybe post a picture with your fans to boost your likes?" Amara's stomach tightened as she glanced at Steph, who remained composed. He leaned back slightly in his booth, his expression calm but unreadable. "I'm just here for coffee," he said evenly, his voice soft but carrying enough weight to quiet the murmurs for a moment. Earl snorted, shaking his head. "Just coffee, huh? You make millions, but what do you actually do for people who need it? Heard you're all about your image, building courts and slapping your name on charity work like it's a brand." "Earl?" Amara's voice was sharper now, her patience wearing thin. She set the plate of pie on the counter with more force than she intended. "That's enough." But Earl ignored her, his gaze fixed on Steph, who continued to meet his eyes without a hint of irritation. "What I don't get," Earl continued, "is why people like you bother coming to places like this. Trying to prove something? Or is this just some little publicity stunt so you can go back to your big house and feel good about yourself?" The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Even Mrs. Fletcher had stopped knitting, her hands frozen mid-stitch as she watched the scene unfold. Amara could feel her pulse quicken, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Earl had always been outspoken, but tonight he'd crossed a line. Steph finally spoke, his voice measured and calm, though there was a firmness to it that wasn't there before. "I'm here for coffee, that's it." "Yeah," Earl shot back, leaning forward as if daring him to elaborate. "Then why don't you tell us about all the lives you've supposedly changed with your money? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're just another guy who likes to play the hero for a headline." The words hung in the air like a bad taste. Steph didn't respond immediately, his silence both unbothered and heavy. Amara couldn't stay quiet any longer. She stepped forward, her voice shaking slightly but gaining strength with every word. "Earl, stop," she said, her tone sharp enough to make him glance at her. "You don't have to like him, but you don't get to humiliate someone for no reason. Steph Curry has done more to help people than most of us ever will. Scholarships, disaster relief, mental health programs. He's changed lives." Earl turned toward her, his expression incredulous. "Oh, come on, Amara. You're just starstruck. What makes you so sure it's not all for show?" Her jaw tightened, the frustration boiling over. "Because he doesn't have to do any of it," she shot back, her voice rising. "He could sit back and enjoy his life without lifting a finger for anyone else, but he chooses to help people. That's more than I can say for someone who sits here every day, judging others without ever lifting a finger to make anything better." A hush fell over the diner. Earl's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he absorbed her words. Amara's hands were trembling, but she didn't back down, her gaze locked on his. Steph, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "I appreciate you standing up for me," he said, glancing at Amara with a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned his attention to Earl, his tone still calm but carrying a quiet authority. "But I don't need to explain myself to you. I'm here to have coffee, just like everyone else." Earl didn't respond immediately, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he turned back to his coffee, muttering something under his breath that no one could hear. The tension lingered, but the moment had passed. Amara exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she met Steph's gaze one more time. "Thank you," he said quietly, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or respect. She nodded, her heart still racing, and returned to the counter. Though the confrontation had ended, the energy in the diner remained charged, like an echo that refused to fade. The room seemed to hold its breath. Earl's words still hung in the air, sharp and accusatory, and Amara could feel every eye in the diner on her as she stepped closer to the center of the tension. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she refused to let the unease stop her. She couldn't. "That's enough, Earl," Amara said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her chest. She met his gaze directly, her words cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. "You don't have to like him, but you don't get to humiliate someone for no reason." Earl leaned back in his stool, his arms crossed, and a smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Humiliate?" he said, dragging out the word like it was a joke. "I'm just calling it like I see it. Guys like him?" "Guys like him," Amara interrupted, her tone sharpening, "have changed lives. Scholarships, disaster relief, mental health programs. Those aren't just words, Earl. Those are actions, and actions speak louder than words." A murmur rippled through the diner, low and hesitant, as the regulars exchanged uncertain glances. Earl's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. He scoffed, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Starstruck," he said, his voice dripping with derision. "That's what you are. You're blinded by the fame, Amara. What makes you so sure it's not all for show?" Amara's breath caught, and for a split second, doubt flickered across her face. Earl's words stung, not because they held any truth, but because they carried the weight of a familiar cynicism, the kind she'd fought against in her own life. But she pushed the doubt aside, letting something stronger take its place. Her shoulders squared, her voice rising above the lingering whispers. "Because he doesn't have to do any of it," she said firmly, each word deliberate and unwavering. "Steph Curry doesn't need to care about anyone but himself. He could sit back and enjoy his life without lifting a finger for anyone else. But he chooses to help people. And that's more than I can say for someone who sits here every day, judging others without ever lifting a finger to help." The silence that followed was deafening. Earl's face hardened, his jaw tightening as her words struck a nerve. For a moment, it seemed like he might fire back. But he hesitated, his usual bravado dimmed by the weight of her conviction. Amara's chest rose and fell with the effort of keeping her emotions in check. She felt exposed, raw, but she didn't back down. Her gaze swept the room, her eyes briefly meeting those of the other regulars. Mrs. Fletcher was staring at her with wide, startled eyes, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Even Earl's usual allies at the counter seemed unsure, shifting awkwardly in their seats. And then there was Steph. He hadn't said a word during her defense, hadn't moved beyond the slight adjustment of his posture. But now, as Amara turned toward him, she saw something in his expression that caught her off guard. Gratitude. It wasn't loud or showy, just a quiet flicker in his eyes and a subtle nod of acknowledgement, like he understood what it had cost her to stand up. Earl finally broke the silence with a dismissive grunt, turning back toward his coffee. "Whatever," he muttered, the fight seemingly drained from him. He stirred his mug with unnecessary vigor, but the bravado was gone. For once, he had nothing more to say. The tension in the diner began to ease. though the air still felt heavy with the remnants of the confrontation. Amara stood frozen for a moment, her hands trembling as the adrenaline ebbed. She glanced around the room, taking in the faces of the other customers, some uncertain, some quietly nodding their approval. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an almost reverent stillness. Finally, Steph spoke, his voice low and steady but carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," he said, the words simple but sincere. He didn't look at Earl. His attention was focused entirely on Amara. She managed a small smile, though her heart was still racing. "You're welcome," she said quietly, before turning and making her way back to the counter. Her movements felt mechanical as she busied herself with refilling sugar dispensers and wiping down surfaces. Anything to keep her hands occupied. She could still feel the weight of the room's attention on her, but she forced herself to breathe, to focus on the task in front of her. The whispers didn't return, and the hum of conversation didn't immediately pick up where it had left off. Instead, the diner settled into a strange, uneasy calm, like the aftermath of a storm. Amara risked another glance towards Steph's booth. He was still there, sipping his coffee and quietly finishing his pie, his demeanor as composed as ever. But this time she thought she caught the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The damage, however, had been done. Amara knew the night's events wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. Not by Earl, not by the other regulars, and certainly not by her. As the minutes ticked by, the adrenaline faded, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. Had she gone too far? Would Earl hold a grudge? Would Mr. Sullivan, the diner's owner, hear about this and reprimand her for stepping out of line? But as she glanced once more at Steph and saw the quiet respect in his expression, she felt a spark of reassurance. She had stood up for what she believed was right, and for now, that was enough. The fume of the diner had finally settled after the earlier confrontation. Amara kept herself busy, refilling salt shakers and wiping down tables, her mind replaying the heated exchange with Earl. The adrenaline had long since worn off, leaving her with a knot of uncertainty in her stomach. She'd stood up for what she believed in, but the fallout was impossible to predict. The kitchen door swung open, and Mr. Sullivan stepped out, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and a perpetually furrowed brow, the kind of boss who rarely left the back office unless something serious had happened. Tonight, it was clear why he was there. He motioned for Amara to join him by the counter, his expression unreadable. "Amara, a word," he said, his tone clipped but low enough not to draw attention. She set the tray she was holding on the counter and followed him toward the back hallway. As soon as they were out of earshot, he turned to face her, arms crossed over his chest. The fluorescent light above them buzzed faintly, adding to the uncomfortable silence. "What were you thinking?" he began, his voice tight with frustration. "You can't argue with customers like that, especially not Earl." Amara bristled at the accusation. "I wasn't arguing," she said, her voice steady but defensive. "I was standing up for someone who didn't deserve to be treated like that." Mr. Sullivan sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to stave off a headache. "Amara," he said, softening his tone just slightly. "Earl's been coming here for 20 years. He's practically part of the furniture. If he leaves, others might follow. I can't afford that kind of loss." The words hit her like a slap, not because they were unexpected, but because they laid bare the stark reality of her position. Amara swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice calm. "And I've worked here for 3 years, she said, her tone tinged with quiet desperation. "Doesn't that loyalty count for anything? I come in early, stay late, cover shifts when no one else will. I do my best to make this place better every single day." Mr. Sullivan didn't respond immediately, his expression conflicted. For a moment, Amara thought he might relent, but then he shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Loyalty does matter, Amara," he said carefully, "but so does keeping the peace. What happened tonight was a step too far. Earl felt disrespected, and that kind of thing spreads. Keeping the peace, Amara repeated, her voice rising slightly despite her best efforts to stay composed. Earl was out of line. He humiliated someone for no reason. Are we really supposed to just sit back and let that happen? Mr. Sullivan's gaze softened, but only for a moment. It's not about right or wrong, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. It's about running a business. I can't have scenes like that scaring off my regulars. Amara's heart sank. She knew where this conversation was headed, but she had to try one last time. Standing up for what's right shouldn't cost me my job, she said, her voice quieter now but no less resolute. I thought that mattered here. He sighed again, looking down at the floor before meeting her eyes. I'm sorry, Amara, he said, his tone final. You can pick up your paycheck tomorrow. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Amara blinked, the sting of rejection sharp and immediate, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. She wouldn't let him see her crumble. That's it then? She asked, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. 3 years of hard work, and this is how it ends? Mr. Sullivan hesitated, his face betraying a flicker of guilt. It's not personal, he said, though they both knew it felt that way. You're a good worker, Amara, but I have to think about the bigger picture. Amara nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. Right, she said simply. The bigger picture. She turned and walked back toward the front of the diner, her steps measured and deliberate. The regulars barely looked up as she passed, and Steph Curry, still seated in his booth, watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read. She didn't stop to acknowledge him, or anyone else. Instead, she grabbed her coat from the back of the counter and slipped it on, the familiar fabric suddenly feeling heavy on her shoulders. As she stepped outside into the crisp night air, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She'd lost her job, a job she'd depended on to keep her family afloat, and all because she refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. But even as the weight of the situation bore down on her, Amara felt a flicker of something else. It wasn't relief, exactly, but a quiet, stubborn pride. She'd done the right thing, and no amount of regret or second-guessing would change that. For now, it would have to be enough. The first light of dawn crept through the thin curtains of Amara's small bedroom, casting a soft glow on the walls. She stared at the ceiling, the weight of the previous night pressing down on her chest like a stone. She hadn't slept much, her mind cycling through every moment of the confrontation, every word exchanged, and the finality of Mr. Sullivan's decision. She rubbed her eyes and sat up slowly, the silence of the early morning feeling heavier than usual. Did I do the right thing? She thought, the question echoing in her mind for what felt like the 100th time. Amara swung her legs over the side of the bed and rested her elbows on her knees, her head in her hands. Was it worth losing everything? She sighed, shaking her head as if to dispel the thought, but it lingered like an unwelcome guest. After a long moment, she stood and got ready for the day. The motions felt mechanical, brushing her hair, pulling on a worn sweater, lacing up her shoes. Each step was accompanied by the nagging uncertainty that had haunted her all night. But beneath the doubt, a small, stubborn voice whispered that she'd done what she had to do, even if it had cost her dearly. On her way out the door, she grabbed her bag and paused, glancing at the framed photo of her family on the wall. It was from years ago, before things had gotten so complicated. Her younger sister, Nina, was smiling wide in her high school graduation gown, and their mother stood behind them, her arm draped protectively around both daughters. Amara traced a finger along the edge of the frame, the image sparking a flood of memories. She thought of the sacrifices her family had made, her mother working double shifts at the factory when they were kids, Nina studying late into the night to keep her grades up for scholarships, and Amara herself taking on the responsibility of keeping everything afloat after their father left. Every choice she'd made, every step she'd taken, had been for them, and now, even without the job that had helped pay the bills, She couldn't let them down. With a deep breath, Amara stepped out into the crisp morning air. The streets were quiet, the only sounds coming from the distant rumble of a garbage truck and the occasional chirp of birds. As she walked toward the diner to pick up her final paycheck, she let the rhythm of her steps ground her. The closer she got, the more her nerves tightened. She couldn't shake the image of Mr. Sullivan's face when he told her she was done, or the murmurs of the regulars who had watched the scene unfold. She dreaded walking through the door, knowing she'd be met with the lingering judgment of those who believed she'd overstepped. But as she rounded the corner and the familiar neon sign of Sonny's Diner came into view, Amara straightened her back and lifted her chin. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could control how she faced it. She'd stood up for someone who needed it, and no amount of doubt or fear would take that away from her. With her head held high, Amara pushed open the door to the diner, ready to face whatever came next. As Amara stepped through the doors of Sonny's Diner, the familiar chime of the bell above her head felt oddly muted. The air inside carried a strange stillness, unlike the usual hum of casual conversation and clinking coffee cups. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw Steph Curry seated at the same booth he'd occupied the night before, his presence once again commanding quiet attention. The regulars, normally quick to exchange whispers or judgmental glances, were unusually subdued. Earl sat hunched over his coffee, staring into his cup as if it held answers. Mrs. Fletcher's knitting needles were motionless in her lap. It was clear that everyone had taken notice of Steph's return, but no one dared speak. Steph looked up as she entered, his expression calm and inviting. He raised a hand in greeting, gesturing for her to come over. Confused and a little uneasy, Amara made her way to the booth, feeling the weight of every eye in the diner following her. She slid into the seat across from him, setting her bag on the floor and folding her hands in her lap. "Morning," Steph said, his voice warm but measured. "Morning," Amara replied, her tone cautious. "I wasn't expecting to see you here again." He smiled faintly, leaning back in the booth. "I don't usually come back to the same place twice when I'm passing through, but last night felt different." Amara shifted slightly, unsure of what to say. Before she could speak, Steph leaned forward, his eyes intent but kind. "You didn't have to stand up for me last night," he said. "But you did. That kind of courage, it's rare, and it doesn't go unnoticed." Her stomach flipped at the unexpected compliment. She glanced around the room, noticing the regulars' subtle glances in their direction. "I just did what I thought was right," she said quietly, her voice steady but uncertain. "That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you," Steph said. He paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "My foundation is expanding. We're working on some big initiatives to support underserved communities, education programs, mental health resources, outreach projects. It's growing fast, and we need people who care about making a difference. People like you." Amara blinked, caught completely off guard. "Me?" she said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm just a waitress." The woman clenched her hands firmly around the mug. Steph tilted his head, studying her for a moment before replying. "You're more than that," he said firmly. "You care about people, and you speak up when it's hard. That's exactly the kind of person we need on the team." Mara felt a wave of doubt rise within her. She shook her head slightly, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like this," she admitted. "I've never done anything like it before. What if I'm not good enough?" Steph's expression softened, and he leaned forward, his voice steady and reassuring. "Nobody ever feels ready," he said, "not for the things that matter most. But the world doesn't need perfect people. It needs people who are willing to try. And from what I saw last night, you're already doing the hard part, standing up when it counts." His words struck a chord deep within her, stirring something she couldn't quite name. For years, Amara had felt stuck, her life defined by routines and responsibilities that left little room for dreaming about something bigger. And yet, here was someone, a global icon, no less, telling her that she could be part of something meaningful, that her voice and actions mattered. "I don't even know where I'd start," she said after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it has to be done. We'll figure that out together," Steph said, his tone unwavering. "You're not alone in this. The foundation has a strong team, and you'd have the support you need every step of the way. All I'm asking is for you to consider it." Amara hesitated, the enormity of the opportunity both thrilling and terrifying. She thought of her family, of Nina's college tuition, of the bills waiting on the kitchen counter at home. But she also thought of the diner, of Earl's harsh words and the suffocating feeling of staying in a place where doing the right thing could cost her everything. Finally, she met Steph's gaze, searching for any hint of insincerity, and finding none. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice firmer this time. "That's all I ask," Steph replied, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "Take your time, but I have a feeling you're going to make the right choice." As Amara left the booth and headed for the counter to collect her paycheck, the world outside the diner seemed a little brighter, the weight on her shoulders a little lighter. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of possibility, a chance to break free from the confines of her ordinary life and step into something extraordinary. Weeks had passed since that unforgettable night at Sonny's diner, and life had taken a dramatic turn for Amara. She'd accepted Steph Curry's offer, stepping into a world she never imagined for herself. Her days were now filled with meetings, community events, and initiatives that brought tangible change to underserved neighborhoods. It was exhausting, challenging, and often overwhelming, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Amara had found purpose in the work, and for the first time, she felt like her actions were part of something much larger. Earl, on the other hand, hadn't seen her since that night. He still occupied his usual stool at Sonny's, still grumbled about the temperature of his coffee, and still maintained his cynicism toward anything or anyone that seemed too good to be true. But even Earl couldn't avoid the world forever. One evening, as he absent-mindedly flipped through TV channels in his dimly lit living room, he landed on a local news segment. The anchor's voice caught his attention. Steph Curry's foundation continues to expand its reach, this time partnering with a passionate new recruit, Amara Clark, to bring educational programs to struggling communities. Earl's hand froze on the remote as Amara's face filled the screen. She was standing at the center of a bustling community center, surrounded by kids with bright eyes and hopeful smiles. Her voice, clear and steady, carried through the TV speakers. "We're not just here to build resources," she said. "We're here to build confidence, to show people that they're seen, valued, and capable of achieving their dreams." The camera panned to highlight the programs Amara had helped establish: tutoring spaces, mental health workshops, and sports programs to engage at-risk youth. Earl leaned forward in his recliner, his usual skepticism wavering as he watched the tangible impact of her efforts. Earl talked about her at-risk mission to help former prisoners, but refused to consider the possibility. For the first time in years, something about what he saw began to chip away at the wall of cynicism he'd built around himself. He thought back to that night at the diner, to the fiery conviction in Amara's voice as she'd stood up for Steph. Earl had written it off at the time as youthful naivety, but now, seeing her in action, he couldn't deny the truth. She'd stood up when the rest of them had stayed silent, and she'd turned that moment into something real and meaningful. Courage waiting. The next day, fate stepped in. Earl was walking through the local park on his way back from the hardware store when he spotted Amara sitting on a bench near the playground. She was holding a notebook, her pen moving quickly across the page, her focus intense. The sight stopped him in his tracks. For a moment he considered walking away, but something compelled him to approach. Clearing his throat, he said, "Didn't expect to see you around here." Amara looked up, startled, but her expression softened when she recognized him. "Earl," she said, a mix of surprise and curiosity in her voice. "Hi." He shifted awkwardly, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. "I saw you on TV last night." he began, his voice gruff but lacking its usual edge. "All that work you're doing, it's impressive." "Sure." Amara tilted her head, studying him carefully. Earl wasn't one to hand out compliments, and the fact that he'd sought her out to say this caught her off guard. "Thank you," she said, her tone genuine. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but pressed on. "I was wrong about you," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "And maybe about him too." He glanced down at his shoes before continuing. "You stood up when the rest of us stayed quiet. I respect that." Amara felt a wave of emotion swell within her. She hadn't expected an apology, much less an acknowledgement from Earl. For as long as she'd known him, he'd been stubbornly set in his ways, his views etched in stone. To hear him admit he'd been wrong was nothing short of remarkable. A small warm smile spread across her face. "It's never too late to start seeing things differently, Earl," she said gently. He nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Maybe it's time I gave that a try." They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of children laughing and playing in the background. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic moment, but it felt significant nonetheless. For Amara, it was a reminder that even the smallest shifts could create ripples of change, and for Earl, it was the first step toward letting go of the bitterness that had weighed him down for so long. As he turned to leave, Earl glanced back over his shoulder. "Keep doing what you're doing, kid. You're making a difference." Amara watched him go, her heart lighter than it had been in days. Earl's redemption wasn't flashy or immediate, but it was real. And in that quiet moment, she realized that change, no matter how small, was always worth striving for. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the community center, casting warm golden light across the bustling space. Tables were lined with art supplies, books, and games, while children and teenagers darted between stations, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Volunteers moved through the crowd, guiding activities and chatting with parents. It was a picture of hope and possibility, the kind of scene Amara had only dreamed of being part of not so long ago. At the front of the room, Amara knelt beside a young girl named Tessa. Barely 10 years old, Tessa had been quiet all afternoon, her wide eyes taking in everything but her lips barely parting to speak. She was clutching a piece of paper in her hands, the edges crumpled from being folded and unfolded too many times. "Are you sure I have to do this?" Tessa asked, her voice barely a whisper. She looked up at Amara, her small frame trembling slightly as the crowd began to settle into their chairs for the event's final segment. Echo clamored for introductions, and Tessa placed her hand across her mouth. Amara met her gaze with a gentle smile, the kind that she wished someone had given her when she was young and uncertain. "It's scary, I know," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "But your voice matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Tessa's eyes searched Amara's for a moment, as though weighing her words, and then she gave a small nod. Amara stood, extending a hand to help Tessa to her feet. "You've got this," she said softly, her words filled with quiet conviction. The room quieted as Tessa stepped onto the small stage at the front of the community center. She hesitated, clutching her paper tightly, her eyes darting across the faces staring back at her. For a moment, it seemed like she might turn and run, but then, as if summoning strength from some deep well within her, she took a breath and began to speak. Her voice wavered at first, but as the words came, it grew steadier. She spoke about her love of drawing, how she'd struggled in school because of her shyness, and how the Foundation's art program had given her a place to feel safe and seen. As she finished, the room erupted into applause, and Tessa's face lit up with a smile so bright it could have warmed the entire building. From the back of the room, Steph watched with quiet satisfaction. He turned to Amara, who had taken a seat in the corner, her hands clasped together as she beamed with pride. "She reminds me of someone," he said, a playful glint in his eye. Amara laughed softly, shaking her head. "I think she's braver than I ever was." Steph tilted his head thoughtfully. "Or maybe you were always this brave. You just didn't have anyone to tell you." The words hit Amara in a way she wasn't expecting, and for a moment, she let herself sit with the thought. She glanced around the room, taking in the sight of kids and parents laughing, talking, and connecting. Every face carried a story, every interaction a possibility. This wasn't just a job, it was a chance to be part of something bigger, something meaningful. Later, as the event wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Amara found herself standing at the edge of the room, watching as volunteers packed up supplies and families lingered to chat. A quiet sense of fulfillment settled over her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her attention. It was a message from her sister, Nina. "Saw the segment on you today. You're doing amazing things, Amara. Proud of you." Amara's heart swelled as she read the words, her mind flashing back to the countless nights she'd stayed awake worrying about whether she was doing enough, whether she was enough. Now, for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. As she walked outside into the crisp evening air, Amira paused by the steps of the community center, looking back at the glowing windows behind her. It had taken everything she had to get to this moment. Every risk, every sacrifice, every hard choice. But seeing the lives that were changing, the seeds of hope that were taking root, she knew it had all been worth it. Steph's words from weeks ago came back to her. "Nobody ever feels ready, but the world needs people who are willing to try." End quote. She smiled to herself, her breath visible in the cool air, and turned to head home. The camera pans back to reveal the community center in full swing, a vibrant hub of laughter, learning, and connection. It's a place where kids like Tessa find their voices, where families find support, and where people like Amara prove that one act of courage can ripple outward in ways they never imagined. Sometimes standing up for what's right costs you everything, but it can also change everything for you and the people you touch. We have begun workers that exercise because we like changing people. It's not that we don't desire change, but we like seeing the world stimulated by radical changes in weight status.